The morning after the blizzard, something was wrong with the picture. Every cabin on that stretch of the Great Plains had suffered. Frozen door frames, cracked window seals, firewood gone in half the expected time. One family burned their extra chairs before sunrise just to keep the children warm. The storm had lasted 3 days, winds screaming at 40 miles per hour, temperatures dropping past minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the land looked like it had been erased. But one cabin was different. Not larger, not better built, not stocked with some imported Eastern stove or double-wall construction. From the outside, it was the same rough-cut timber and clay chinking as all the others. And yet, when the neighbors finally made their rounds through the drifts that January morning, they found her inside, calm, unhurried, the fire barely touched. What they noticed, though they didn't understand it, was the wall. The south-facing wall of her cabin was still surrounded by the dry, dead stalks of last summer's sunflowers. Dozens of them, thick-stemmed, standing shoulder-high even under the weight of snow. They had been there since September. People had assumed she simply hadn't gotten around to clearing them. A few had quietly called it stubborn. 1 or 2 had called it foolish, planting flowers against a working wall, wasting good soil that could have grown something useful. No one had thought to ask why she planted them there, in that exact position, at that exact density. No one had asked what those stalks were doing to the wind before it ever reached the wood. That question, the one nobody thought to ask, is what this video is about. Because what happened to her cabin during that blizzard wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. And it certainly wasn't decoration. There was a decision embedded in those sunflower rows that most people walk past 100 times without ever seeing. A decision rooted in something older than the homestead itself, and more precise than it looked. If you've ever wondered what the old-timers understood about heat, wind, and shelter that we've mostly forgotten, stick around. This story is going to show you exactly where that knowledge was hidden. And subscribe if you're new here. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Whether it's the northern plains, the mountains, or somewhere that gets its own brutal winters, we want to hear from you. Her name, according to local homestead record from Custer County, Nebraska, was Marin Soulberg, a Norwegian-born widow who had taken over a 160-acre claim alone after her husband died of fever in the summer of 1883. She was 34 years old, spoke accented English, and had no male relatives within 2 days' ride. What she did have was a clear-eyed understanding of what the Great Plains wanted to do to the people who underestimated it. The cabin she inherited was modest, even by frontier standards. Roughly 16 feet by 20 feet, framed in cottonwood timber with walls chinked in clay and straw, it sat low on a slight rise above a dry creek bed. The north and west walls bore the full punishment of winter. The dominant winds on the Nebraska plains swept down from the northwest in long, unbroken corridors, dragging cold air from Canada across hundreds of miles of flat, treeless land before slamming into anything brave enough to stand upright. Those walls were cold walls, shadow walls, walls that spent the winter hemorrhaging heat into the dark. The south wall was different. The south wall faced the low winter sun. Most homesteaders used that south-facing exposure for one thing only, a window if they could afford the glass, or a shuttered opening if they couldn't. Light was precious. Visibility mattered. But Marin Soulberg did something that nobody else on that stretch of road had done. In the spring of 1884, she tilled a narrow strip of earth, no more than 3 feet wide, directly against the south wall's base, and she planted sunflowers. Not in a garden bed set apart from the structure. Against the structure, row after dense row, spaced no more than 8 inches apart, seeds pressed into the soil with deliberate regularity. By July, the stalks had reached 6 feet. By August, some had cleared 7. The flower heads tracked the sun from east to west each day, their broad faces absorbing light with quiet mechanical precision. The south wall behind them sat in partial shade during the hottest afternoon hours, cooler in summer, a factor neighbors noticed and quietly approved of. But summer was not the point. Summer was never the point. What Marin understood, and what no neighbor thought to ask her about, was what those plants would become after the first hard frost killed them. They would not become waste. They would not become rot. They would become something the Great Plains had almost no natural supply of, a standing structure. A dense, fibrous, upright wall of dry organic material positioned directly between the prevailing winter wind and the most thermally vulnerable face of her home. The neighbors saw flowers. She saw architecture. She never explained herself to anyone who didn't ask. And in Custer County in 1884, very few people thought to ask a Norwegian widow why she grew sunflowers. There's a concept in thermal physics that most people will never learn by name, but that every organism on the Great Plains understood instinctively: convective heat loss. It is the process by which moving air strips warmth from a surface far more aggressively than still air ever could. A wall sitting in calm air loses heat slowly through conduction alone, the gradual transfer of energy from warm material to cold material, molecule by molecule. But introduce wind, sustained, cutting, 25-mile-per-hour plains wind, and that same wall begins losing heat at a rate that could be 4 to 6 times higher. The wind is not just cold. It is actively pulling the warmth out of everything it touches. This was the silent enemy of every cabin on the Nebraska frontier. Not the cold itself, but the wind carrying the cold and replacing it endlessly against every exposed surface of every structure on the plains. Log walls that might have held their interior temperature respectably well on a calm night became thermal sieves the moment a northwestern gale arrived. Most homesteaders responded to this problem by burning more wood. It was the obvious solution. If the cabin was losing heat faster, you added more heat. The problem with this logic was not moral, but practical. Wood on the treeless plains was desperately scarce. Families hauled it from creek bottoms, traded for it at considerable expense, or burned dried buffalo chips and corn cobs when timber ran out. Every cord of wood that the wind stole through a poorly protected wall was a cord of wood that had to be found, cut, hauled, and stored, a cost measured not just in dollars but in days of labor and, in the worst winters, in genuine survival margins. Marin's neighbors were burning between 4 and 6 cords of wood to survive a single Nebraska winter, according to general homestead accounts from that period. Some families reported running short by February, when the worst storms still had weeks left to run. What the neighbors didn't see when they looked at her sunflower wall was this: those dry stalks, standing 6 to 7 feet tall and packed 8 inches apart across the full 16-foot length of the south wall, were intercepting the wind before it touched the timber. Not stopping it entirely. No plant barrier stops wind entirely, but disrupting it, breaking its laminar flow, forcing it to slow, divide, and tumble through a matrix of fibrous stems rather than running clean and fast along the flat face of the wall. The result was a narrow band of significantly calmer air trapped between the stalks and the wall itself, a zone where wind speed might drop to a fraction of the open field velocity. In that still zone, convective heat loss from the south wall dropped with it. The wall was no longer being continuously stripped. It was being allowed to hold what little warmth it had accumulated through the day's low winter sun. The neighbors walked past this every morning. They saw dead flowers. They did not see a wind management system. That is the nature of vernacular engineering. It looks, to the untrained eye, exactly like something else. To understand what Marin Soulberg had built, it helps to think about what a sunflower stalk actually is. By late October on the Nebraska plains, after the first killing frost has ended the growing season, a mature sunflower stalk is no longer a living organism. It is a cylinder of dried, fibrous material, partially hollow at the core, dense and lignified at the outer rings, standing between 5 and 8 feet tall, depending on variety and growing conditions. The stem wall itself is roughly a half-inch thick at mid-height, composed of a material not entirely unlike balsa wood in its structural properties: lightweight, porous, and a poor conductor of heat. At the base, where the stalk is thickest, diameters of 1.5 to 2 inches were common in the tall-growing varieties favored for seed oil production in that era. Those properties matter because what Marin had created along her south wall was not just a windbreak. It was a layered thermal barrier, and it worked through 3 distinct mechanisms operating simultaneously. The first mechanism was wind disruption, as described in the previous chapter. The dense packing of stalks, no more than 8 inches apart, across 16 linear feet, created what engineers today would call a permeable barrier. Unlike a solid fence, which forces wind over the top and can create turbulent downdrafts on the far side, a permeable barrier slows and scatters the wind through its body, reducing velocity without creating the chaotic eddies that a solid wall generates. Research on agricultural windbreaks, conducted a century after Marin's time, but confirming what she had practiced, suggests that a well-designed permeable barrier can reduce wind speed by 50 to 70% in a sheltered zone immediately behind it, extending inward for a distance roughly equal to the barrier's height. A 6-foot sunflower wall protecting a zone 6 feet deep would cover the entire width of the south wall's exposed face. The second mechanism was dead air insulation. Between the stalks and the timber wall, a narrow band of air, perhaps 12 to 18 inches wide, was sheltered from wind movement. Still air is one of the most effective natural insulators known. It is the principle behind down feathers, wool fibers, and modern spray foam alike. Trap air in place, and it cannot carry heat away. That trapped band of calm air along Marin's south wall acted as a thermal buffer layer, adding effective insulation to a wall that had none built into its construction. The third mechanism was subtler, solar mass activation. The south wall, shielded from wind-driven cooling, was able to absorb and retain more of the low winter sun's radiant energy than an exposed wall could. On a clear January day in Nebraska's latitude, the sun sits low in the southern sky, its angle ideal for striking a vertical south-facing surface. A wall that is not being actively cooled by convection can warm measurably under that direct radiation and release that stored warmth slowly into the cabin interior through the night. 3 mechanisms. 1 row of dead plants. No moving parts. The autumn of 1886 arrived early and without apology. By the second week of October, temperatures across the Central Plains had already dipped below freezing on several nights. Unusual for that time of year, and noted with quiet unease by the older homesteaders who had learned to read the season's temperament. The grasses had gone brown fast. The creek beds had thinned. There was something in the quality of the northwest wind, a particular flatness to it, a persistence that didn't ease with noon, that suggested the winter forming on the far side of the horizon was not going to be ordinary. Marin Soulberg had watched that same sky for 3 seasons now. She knew the difference between an early cold snap and a season setting its jaw. In late October, she made her assessments quietly and without drama. The sunflower stalks had dried fully after the first frost and stood rigid against the south wall, their broad seed heads already harvested and stored. The stalks themselves she left in place. She reinforced the base of each row with a low berm of packed earth, no more than 6 inches high, enough to anchor the stems against the wind that was already picking up from the northwest. Her neighbors were doing other things. Some were cutting more wood or traveling farther than previous years to find standing timber worth cutting. Others were banking the bases of their cabins with sod blocks or straw, a common plains technique for reducing cold air infiltration beneath the floor. Both were sensible practices. Neither of them addressed the south wall. The south wall was always assumed to take care of itself. It faced the sun, didn't it? It was the warm side, the good side, hardly worth worrying about. This assumption contained a fatal misunderstanding of how plains weather actually worked. The dominant winter wind came from the northwest, true, but on the open plains, wind does not blow in straight, well-behaved lines. It curls around structures, wraps corners, and in the course of a sustained 3-day blizzard, it reaches every exposed face of every building eventually. A cabin battered by northwest wind on its back and northeast wind on its flank will find its south wall subjected to sustained air movement as the storm rotates. Cold air flowing across it fast enough to suppress any solar gain the wall might otherwise have achieved. By November, the other homesteaders had settled into their winter routines. Wood consumption was already higher than the previous year. Families were rationing heat more deliberately, letting fires drop lower at night, sleeping in heavier layers. The margins were thin, and the worst of it hadn't arrived yet. Marin's woodpile, neighbors would later note, appeared remarkably intact for mid-November. She was burning, by all visible evidence, at a noticeably slower rate. No one asked why. It was, after all, just one woman's cabin. Maybe she ran a cooler house. Maybe she didn't mind the cold. No one thought to look at the wall. The storm that arrived in the second week of January 1887 was not the worst blizzard the Great Plains had ever seen. But it was severe enough, sustained enough, and cold enough to expose every weakness in every structure it touched. And it touched everything. The system moved in from the northwest on a Wednesday afternoon, which local oral accounts describe as first appearing as a dark line along the horizon, low and fast-moving, like a curtain being drawn across the sky. Within 2 hours, visibility had dropped to less than 50 feet. Wind speeds reached 35 to 40 miles per hour and held there, steady and unrelenting, for the better part of 3 days. Temperatures fell to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit at the coldest point, a reading recorded at a general store in the nearest town, roughly 14 miles from Marin's claim. At those temperatures and wind speeds, the wind chill effect on exposed surfaces was severe. A cabin wall subjected to a 40-mile-per-hour wind at minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit experiences effective surface temperatures far below the ambient air. The moving air strips the boundary layer of warmth from the surface almost as fast as the material can regenerate it. Interior temperatures in poorly sheltered cabins could drop by 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit within a few hours under such conditions, even with a fire burning steadily. The accounts that survive from neighboring homesteads paint a consistent picture. Fires that could not keep pace with the heat loss. Firewood consumed at twice the normal rate. Families huddled in the smallest interior room or gathered around the stove in shifts through the night. One family reportedly burned part of a wooden bed frame before the storm broke. Another ran so low on fuel that they began dismantling a storage lean-to for timber on the third day. Marin Soulberg burned no furniture. She dismantled no outbuildings. What the sunflower barrier was doing during those 3 days was exactly what it had been designed, consciously or through inherited knowledge, to do. The stalks intercepted the wind before it reached the south wall's timber face, reducing its velocity in the sheltered zone behind them by an estimated 50 to 60%. In that quieter air, the wall's thermal behavior changed fundamentally. Instead of losing heat continuously to convective stripping, it was allowed to drain slowly through conduction alone. The difference in interior temperature between a well-sheltered cabin wall and an exposed one, under those wind conditions, could plausibly account for 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, a gap that translated directly into hours of retained warmth and significant reductions in required fuel. 3 days, one wall, dozens of dead sunflower stalks that everyone had assumed were just waiting to be cleared. When the wind finally dropped and the sky went still on Saturday morning, the landscape was white and silent and reshaped. Marin opened her door into 3 feet of drifted snow. Her fire had not gone out once. She did not go out immediately. That was the first thing the neighbors noticed when they finally made their way through the drifts to check on one another. Most homesteaders, especially those who had spent 3 days feeding a struggling fire and rationing their last split logs, were outside within minutes of the wind dying, anxious, assessing damage, digging out, moving. There was an urgency to the aftermath of a blizzard that had nothing to do with impatience. It came from a specific dread of finding out what the storm had taken. Marin was seen outside mid-morning, moving without visible haste. She cleared a path to the woodshed, assessed the animal shelter on the north side of the property, and returned inside. She had not, by any observable account, spent the previous 3 days in crisis. Her neighbors had, and they were beginning to put together a picture that didn't quite make sense. The Halvorsen family, whose claim sat roughly a quarter mile to the northeast, had burned through their full reserve and spent the final night of the blizzard-burning fence posts to keep their stove alive. Their interior temperature, by the father's later account, had dropped so low that the water bucket near the door had developed a skin of ice despite the fire burning steadily. They had consumed, in 3 days, what they expected to last 3 weeks. The Reinhardt family, to the south and west, had fared better. Their cabin was tighter built, with a heavier stove, but had still burned through nearly twice the expected fuel. Their assessment of Marin's situation shared aloud as they compared notes with the Halvorsons. She must have been cold the whole time. A woman alone, smaller cabin, thinner walls. She must have simply endured it. They were wrong, and the evidence was right in front of them. Standing beside her cabin that morning, visible to anyone who looked, was the south wall, and against it, the sunflower stalks, battered but mostly upright, their stems bent at angles by the wind's pressure, but unbroken, still standing in their dense rows, still anchored by the earthen berm she had packed around their bases in October. The stalks had caught and held enormous quantities of drifted snow on their windward side, a 3-foot bank of compressed snow leaning against them from the west, a testament to the wind energy they had absorbed and redirected before it ever touched the timber behind them. Snow piled against a barrier is not an accident. It is physical evidence. Every pound of snow in that drift represented a parcel of wind-carried air that had been slowed, forced to drop its load, and deflected before striking the wall. The wall itself was comparatively clear on its inner face, sheltered, the timber surface dusted only lightly. The contrast was visible to anyone standing there. Exposed wall on the north face, scoured clean and frostbitten. Protected wall on the south, quiet and intact behind its dead plant shield. No one that morning understood what they were looking at. It would take weeks before the conversation shifted, and even then it came in fragments. A comment here, a question there. The Halvorson boy, 13 years old, reportedly stood looking at the sunflower wall for a long time before his father called him away. He never forgot it. Decades later, local accounts suggest he planted sunflowers against the south wall of every structure he ever built. In the weeks following the blizzard, a clearer picture began to emerge. Not through any formal study, but through the natural accounting that frontier communities performed after every crisis. Who had burned what? Who had run short? Who had been comfortable and who had suffered? The accounting was imprecise by modern standards, but its outlines were consistent. The homesteads in the immediate area had consumed, on average, between 2 and 3 times their normal weekly fuel ration during the 3-day storm. This was not surprising. Extraordinary cold demanded extraordinary fuel. What was notable was the outlier. Marin Soulberg's fuel consumption during the same period, as best her neighbors could estimate from observing her woodpile before and after, appeared to be roughly half of what her nearest comparable neighbor had burned. Same storm, same region, cabins of similar size and construction. The difference was not in her stove. It was not in some special which she had stored or some superior technique of fire management. The difference, as best anyone could reason through it, was in how much heat she had been required to generate in the first place, because her cabin had been losing it more slowly. To put a plausible shape on the thermal difference, a cabin wall exposed to 40-mile-per-hour wind at minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit is losing heat through convection at a rate dramatically higher than a wall sitting in still air at the same temperature. If the sunflower barrier reduced effective wind speed at the south wall surface from 40 miles per hour to somewhere between 15 and 20 miles per hour, the convective heat loss through that wall would have been reduced by a meaningful fraction. Conservative estimates, based on standard wind-heat transfer relationships, suggest a reduction in heat loss through that face of 30 to 45% under sustained storm conditions. For a small cabin, that is not a trivial number. The south wall of a 16 by 20-foot structure represents roughly 160 square feet of exposed surface. If that surface is losing heat 35% more slowly than its neighbor's equivalent walls, the interior temperature advantage accumulates steadily over the course of a 3-day storm, not as a dramatic spike, but as a slow, compounding difference. 8 degrees, 10 degrees, 12 degrees of interior temperature maintained without additional fuel. In a cabin where 40 degrees Fahrenheit inside meant the food stayed frozen and the family slept in their coats, those degrees were not comfort. They were survival margin. The neighbors did the informal math. They reached no unified conclusion. Some attributed Marin's advantage to luck, or to some personal hardiness, or to the simple fact that a single woman generated less body heat demand than a family. Others, the more observant ones, kept looking at the sunflower wall. One neighbor, a practical-minded farmer named August Dreyer, whose claim abutted Marin's to the north, reportedly asked her directly, sometime in February, what the plants against her south wall were for. Her answer, as recalled by his wife in a letter cited in a county historical compilation, was brief. They break the wind before the wind breaks the wall. Dreyer planted sunflowers in the spring. So did two of his neighbors the following year. The idea did not spread further than that. And that silence is its own kind of story. There is a pattern in the history of vernacular engineering that repeats itself with uncomfortable regularity. The technique works, the evidence is visible, the logic is sound, and the knowledge still dies with the person who held it. It happened to Marin Soulberg's sunflower wall, and the reasons it happened reveal as much about frontier society as they do about the limits of informal knowledge transfer. The first reason was the nature of credibility on the frontier. Knowledge in that culture and era carried weight in proportion to who held it. A university-trained architect, a government agricultural agent, an established male landowner with acreage and standing. These voices were heard and remembered. A Norwegian widow farming a 160-acre claim alone, speaking accented English, growing flowers against her cabin wall. Her knowledge was observed, occasionally copied in small ways, but never formalized, never taught, never written down in the publications and almanacs that shaped how homesteaders built. The second reason was the problem of visibility. The mechanism by which the sunflowers worked was invisible. You could not point to a thermal gradient. You could not show a neighbor the dead air space between stalk and timber and make them feel the difference it made. What you could show them was a woodpile that had lasted longer than expected and a cabin that had come through a blizzard without crisis. But those outcomes were easy to attribute to other causes: personal toughness, a better sealed door, lighter sleeping habits, smaller family. The third reason was seasonal forgetting. By spring, the crisis of January was over. The sunflower stalks had been pulled down or had fallen under the weight of late snow. The south wall looked like every other wall. The urgency to understand what had happened dissolved with the return of warmth and the specific configuration that had made the difference. Plant against wall, planted in spring, left standing through winter, required planting across 3 seasons to replicate. Frontier life did not reward planning 3 seasons ahead. It rewarded surviving this one. The fourth reason, and perhaps the most honest one, was the ease of a simpler explanation. Even among those who noticed that Marin's cabin had fared better, the conclusion most readily available was not she engineered a botanical windbreak, but she got lucky or she's tougher than she looks. The idea that a row of dead plants had outperformed conventional winter preparation was, for most people who encountered it, genuinely difficult to hold in mind. It required accepting that something that looked ornamental and slightly eccentric had been, in practice, more effective than what everyone else was doing. That is a hard thing to accept about a neighbor. It is an especially hard thing to accept about a widow who planted flowers. The technique did not vanish entirely. August Dreyer used it and passed it to his children. 2 neighboring families adopted it in modified forms. Not always sunflowers, not always as densely planted, not always as close to the wall, which diluted its effectiveness and made it harder to evaluate. Within a generation, the specific practice that Marin had developed had blurred into a general vague sense that planting tall things near the south wall was probably useful somehow. The precision was lost. The knowledge survived only in outline. More than a century after Marin Soulberg packed earth around the base of her sunflower rows, the principles she had applied were being studied, quantified, and published in agricultural and engineering journals. Described in language she would never have used, confirmed by instruments she would never have seen, and applied in contexts she could not have imagined. The formal study of windbreaks as thermal management tools for buildings developed primarily in the second half of the 20th century, driven initially by agricultural economics, the question of how to protect crops and livestock from wind stress, and later by the energy crisis of the 1970s, which pushed researchers toward passive strategies for reducing heating and cooling loads in residential structures. What they found confirmed, with instrumented precision, the logic embedded in Marin's south wall. A dense vegetative barrier planted within 12 to 24 inches of an exterior wall, close enough to create a sheltered air zone between plant and surface, but not so close as to trap moisture against the wood, reduces the convective coefficient of that wall under wind conditions by a measurable and significant amount. Studies conducted by university extension programs in the northern Great Plains found that properly positioned windbreaks reduced home heating energy consumption by between 10 and 40%, depending on climate zone, structure type, and windbreak design. The upper end of that range, 40%, was associated with structures that had windbreak coverage on multiple faces and minimal wind exposure gaps. Marin had worked with one wall, one growing season, one variety of plant, and she had done it with no instruments, no journal access, and no institutional support. The specific properties of the sunflower stalk that made it effective as a close proximity windbreak, its height, its stem density when planted tightly, its resistance to compression under snow load, its persistence through winter without significant decomposition in dry plains conditions, were not accidental virtues. They were the product of a plant that had been grown, harvested, and observed on the Great Plains for thousands of years before European settlement. Indigenous agricultural communities of the Central Plains had cultivated sunflowers as a staple crop for generations, and their practices, including the management of crop residue, the placement of windbreaks, and a relationship between plant architecture and shelter, represented a body of applied ecological knowledge that predated Marin's homestead by centuries. Whether Marin had absorbed any of this knowledge through contact with indigenous communities, through Norwegian folk traditions of windbreak planting that carried analogous principles, or through her own direct observation and reasoning, is not recorded. What is recorded, through oral accounts, her neighbor's letter, and the evidence of her surviving woodpile, is that it worked. That is the only test that matters on a minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit night in January. There's a phrase used in contemporary sustainable architecture that would have baffled most people in 1887, passive thermal management. It refers to the design of buildings and their surrounding landscape to manage heat gain, heat retention, and heat loss without mechanical systems. No furnaces, no blowers, no thermostats. Just geometry, materials, orientation, and biology arranged intelligently in relation to sun and wind. It is, today, an emerging premium feature of high-end sustainable homes. Landscape architects charge significant fees to design living windbreaks and green buffer zones for residential properties, analyzing prevailing wind direction, solar exposure angles, and plant species selection to optimize the thermal performance of exterior walls. The principles are the same ones Marin Soulberg applied with seeds and soil, and the plain understanding that dead things standing in the wind still do work. The irony is precise, and it does not soften with time. What was dismissed as eccentricity in 1884 is now marketed as innovation in 2024. What a Norwegian widow figured out alone, on a treeless plain, with no budget and no institutional support, now appears in building science literature under technical terminology and costs thousands of dollars to implement professionally. The knowledge did not change. The status of the person holding it did. This is not a minor observation. It is a pattern that runs through the entire history of vernacular engineering. The techniques that survive best are the ones that got written down by people with access to paper, presses, and professional standing. The techniques that worked equally well, or better, but live in the practice of people who were poor, female, immigrant, or indigenous, were filtered out of the record, not because they failed, but because the systems for recognizing and transmitting knowledge were not built for them. Marin's sunflower wall did not fail. It was simply never formally taught. What remains is the logic, and the logic is intact. A dense barrier of vertical organic material, planted within arm's reach of a south-facing wall, oriented perpendicular to the prevailing winter wind, does three things simultaneously. It reduces convective heat loss from the wall surface. It creates a dead air insulation layer between stalk and timber, and it allows the wall to accumulate and retain solar warmth that would otherwise be stripped away before it could penetrate the structure. The combined effect in a sustained cold wind event is the difference between a cabin that holds and a cabin that struggles. Sunflowers are not the only plant that can do this. Tall-growing sorghum, Jerusalem artichoke, dried corn rows left standing. Any dense, fibrous, upright plant material left in place through winter against a vulnerable wall will perform some version of this function. The specific advantage of the sunflower is its height, its stalk rigidity under snow load, and its rapid growth from seed in a single season, meaning it can be replanted year after year with minimal effort and zero cost beyond the seeds themselves. Marin replanted every spring for as long as she held the claim, more than a decade by county records. Every October, the stalks dried. Every November, they stood their ground. Every January, they broke the wind before the wind broke the wall. She never called it engineering. She never wrote it down. She simply did it, season after season, because it worked. That is the oldest form of proof there is. This script is produced for historical and educational purposes only. It does not constitute engineering or construction advice. Always consult qualified professionals before attempting any structural modification.